what we can and cannot do with adaptive designs and where they might be useful. So first of all, what's the general idea of an adaptive design? The idea is quite simple. We want to modify an ongoing clinical trial, but we don't want to do this at will. We don't want to do this just at the whim, but we want to do this by design. So we're going to think about, a priori to starting the study, what kind of changes might be useful for our study once we have seen data. So we collect data, and then based on these data, make or do not make adaptations to a design in order to enhance flexibility. And that's all nice and good, but contradicts everything I was told when I did my master's degree, which was when you do a study, you start and then you leave it until you have all the data. Because the challenge is you need to do this without undermining the study integrity and the validity of the study. And so that's our challenge with these adaptive designs. So how does a traditional, or what I call a fixed sample design work? We plan our study, we fix in our sample size. Once we're happy with the design, we start, recruit, observe, recruit, observe, recruit, observe, observe, until we have sufficient information, and then everybody holds their breath, analyze, and hope for the best. In an adaptive design, obviously we still plan the study, but rather than fixing sample size, we fix the design because we allow for the possibility to make changes to that design. Once we're happy with that, and actually my schematic here is probably slightly misleading in the sense that I think the space between planning the study and start is the same as for the fixed sample design. In reality, it probably takes a little bit longer to set up that study. And then we start, recruit, observe, but we don't do this until we have observed everyone that we plan to recruit, but we have a look at the data at some earlier point at an interim analysis. And at this interim analysis, we can make adaptations to our design. And some of the adaptations that we could do is we could decide, very extreme adaptation, we stop. We give up either because the treatment doesn't seem to be performing well enough, or because it's doing so well that we got all the evidence we need. We might want to change the dose, we might want to change the regimen, we might want to change the sample size, change the population, drop or add the treatment, and so on and so forth. So there's a couple of different things, or a list of different adaptations that we could consider. Now, clearly that list is not exhaustive, and we don't need to do just one of them. At an interim analysis, we can actually combine multiple of these changes at a look at the data. But again, keeping in mind that this is all pre-specified, we think about this before we start the study. So here is an example of one of the most common adaptive designs, which is sample size re-estimation. And the way that it works is to say, I'm planning my study to recruit a certain number of patients. I collect data on the first set of patients in my stage one, before my first interim analysis. And at that first interim analysis, I'm going to check and verify whether or not the sample size that I thought was going to be sufficient for my study is indeed sufficient. And if it is, great, then I'll continue with my original plan, illustrated here at the top. I'm just going to continue to recruit my 12 patients here in my example. But if one of my planning assumptions was incorrect, I'm going to change my sample size. I'm going to, in my illustration here, increase the sample size, maybe because there's more uncertainty in my outcome than I was expecting. And therefore, rather than running a study that's underpowered and therefore is not going to answer reliably the question that I'm posing, I'm going to increase the sample size in order to make sure that the study has the chance to answer the question that it was set out to answer. So the main benefit of such a sample size re-estimation is it will ensure that we can appropriately answer the question that we have posed. Obviously, that comes at cost. There are challenges with that. There are operational challenges, and they are going to be very similar for many of the adaptive designs that I'm talking about. We need to prepare the data for interim analyses. Sounds like a trivial exercise because obviously everybody is looking at clean data all the time anyway, but in reality, there's extra effort making sure that I have good data to make my interim decision. I need to think about how can I maintain blinding if it is a blinded study in the first place, and so on and so forth. There's some statistical questions. Can I statistically ensure that I don't need to unblind the data in the first place, for example? And it does have some impact on study properties, error rates in particular, if we do sample size re-estimation. Another class of adaptive designs are multi-stage design, also known as group sequential designs. And the thinking there is that I'm just going to assess partway through my study whether or not there's sufficient promise in my treatment to warrant continuing, or possibly even have already sufficient information that I know whatever I needed to know in order to answer my question. So this is how such a study would look like. I would start by recruiting my first set of patients, my first N1 patients. I'm going to find my comparative metric. Is group 1 better than group 2? Calculate that, and in my illustration here, this is it, the result is illustrated by an X. If that X is in the red, is below the red bar, our conclusion is, sorry, this is hopeless, we better give up. There's no point in wasting any more resources, exposing any more patients to this treatment because it has very limited chance of doing something positive. If it happens to be in the green region, we pop out the champagne and celebrate because we have already shown that treatment 1 is better than treatment 2, for example. If, such as in my illustration, my comparative statistic falls between those two values, the conclusion is need more data. And so, in this case, I'm going to collect additional data until I have a total of N2 patients. Again, I'm going to calculate my comparative statistic and once more compare against my green and red boundaries. In this case, once more, conclusion being I need more data, and so I continue to collect additional observations until at the third time of asking, I'm going to find, yes, actually, I already have sufficient evidence to answer the question that I set out to answer. For example, is treatment 1 better than treatment 2? And I can stop at this point and do whatever the next step in my development is. So the benefits of that kind of design is that it will stop investigations of bad treatments early. So if a treatment doesn't do what it's supposed to do, it's out very quickly. At the same time, if I have the wonder drug, the wonder treatment, then I can also speed up getting it to all patients, not just the patients within the trial, because I can reach my conclusion that it does something good earlier. At the same time, I'm going to have operational challenges, which are very similar to the ones that I've described for the sample size re-estimation. I need to do the interim analysis, so I need to have data. I need to make sure that if it's a blinded study, that things stay blinded, and so on and so forth. There are also a couple of statistical challenges associated with that. If I look at my data multiple times, there's a risk that I increase my false decision probability, and so we're going to have to account for that. There's a risk that we stop because just by random chance, we get a very good result or a very bad result, and that impacts our effect estimation. And I think Philip after me will talk a little bit more about this. So group sequential, multi-stage design, and sample size re-estimation are the most common types of adaptive designs. We can combine these design features, so we can have a group sequential design with sample size re-estimation. The benefits in general are I get better decisions at the end. I get more appropriate answers to the questions that I'm posing. And in general, the challenges are operationally, it's much more complex to do these studies. And there's a risk of unblinding, data information leakage, and we've seen this on the slide before, and a risk of bias because of random processes involved in this. So let's look at a couple of other adaptive design. I can extend this concept of a multi-stage design to say, oh, I'm not just interested in one treatment, but what if I'm interested in multiple treatments? So a multi-arm, multi-stage design, a MAMS design, would have, as here in my schematic, 3 different treatments that are each compared against a control group. And the process would be very similar to my multi-stage design. If any of those comparative evaluations is in the red regions, I'm going to give up. If it's in the green region, I'm going to celebrate, otherwise need more data. So here, conclusion would be not worth continuing with treatment 2. It just doesn't have enough promise to continue. But the other 2 are potentially useful, and so I continue with them. At the second time of asking, again, I still can't make a decision about those 2, so need more data. And then, in the third time, I find that treatment 1 is actually better than my comparator, than my control, and so I can go on, do whatever it is I want to do. And the next step, depending on what the treatments are, I might stop at this point, or I might continue just with treatment 3. Again, this will depend on the context of your study. So just as before, the benefits are I'm going to stop things that aren't working well quickly. I'm going to stop things that work well quickly as well in order to move forward with their development. And I'm going to use the same comparator, making the design more efficient, needing fewer patients in total. Challenges, on the other hand, same as before. I got my operational challenges. I have the challenges of having multiple looks at the data. I have the challenges of having multiple treatments that I'm considering, and I have challenges because of stopping of random highs or low, just as before. I can then extend this and say, well, I could move this concept of a multi-arm, multi-stage design into a platform design. And this is just a snapshot of what the recovery trial looked like at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it started off comparing 4 different treatments against standard of care. It had the opportunity to stop treatments because they are not doing well, such as happened with the hydroxychloroquine evaluation. It had the opportunity to stop working treatments because, well, we have enough evidence, such as with dexamethasone, so that's the same as our multi-arm, multi-stage setup. But in addition, you could see that treatments have been added to the design as the study was ongoing. So we get the same benefits as for a multi-arm, multi-stage design, early stopping, either because the treatment is bad or because it's good. But in addition, we have an opportunity to reuse all the infrastructure that we've put in place in order to run the study to investigate additional treatments that might not have been available at the start of the study that we might want to investigate as well. Operational challenges on top of the ones that we've already talked about. There's a question about how do I actually add my treatments? How do I make sure that all my sites, do I use all my sites for this new investigation that has been added? What do I do with allocating patients? Am I trying to catch up with the other treatments, or am I going to just expect that the new treatment is going to take longer to get in question, and so on and so forth. Similarly and related, additional statistical questions include, when should I add? Because obviously if I have too many treatments in my study, I'm not going to answer any of my questions. So when is it sensible for all of the for treatment to be added to the study? What should my control group be? Easy at the beginning, right? I started off with standard of care versus my 4 treatments. But what do I do once I have a new treatment that has been shown to be better? I'm changing. Do I change my control group? Or do I answer a question that might not be fully relevant anymore by comparing to an old standard of care? So lots of ongoing questions and quite a lot of active research in this area. We can also go down a personalized medicine route through adaptive enrichment designs. So here, my population is comprised of males and females. Think about biomarker positive, biomarker negative patient groups. And at the onset, I might think my treatment could be helpful for everyone, but I fear that it might only work for one of the 2 groups. And so in an adaptive enrichment design, in the first stage, I recruit from the entire pool of patients. And then, depending on how promising results are at the interim analysis or at interim analyses, I'm going to either continue recruiting everyone, because there's promise that this treatment helps both biomarker positive and biomarker negative patients, or, as illustrated here at the bottom, maybe it turns out the benefit in females isn't large enough to warrant continuing, and therefore I'm focusing in on the group that I think has the best chance of benefiting from that treatment. So what it will do, it will tailor, it will sort of focus in on the right group of patients. Well, that's what we're trying to do. There are a couple of challenges there around how different do the groups need to be for me to decide, oh, I'm not going to continue with the female group. Right? Maybe I have a little bit of benefit in the female group, but I have a huge benefit in the male group. Do I continue with everyone, or do I only continue with the male group in this case? So a couple of interesting questions around this. Final design that my whistle-stop tour is going to talk about is response adaptive randomization, which is the idea that I use the data that I have observed to alter how likely it is for future patients to get a particular treatment. So here in my illustration, I start off with 3 treatments. Initially, there's an equal chance for patients to get one of those 3 treatments. And so at this first interim analysis, I'm going to get equal number of patients, approximately at least, to investigate. And then based on how well the treatment does, we decide whether we increase the number of patients that gets this treatment or decrease the number of patients that gets this treatment. So here in my illustration, looks like treatment 1 didn't do particularly well, and therefore we're going to decrease the allocation ratio. We're going to decrease how many patients are going to be recruited. Treatment 2 seems to have done particularly well, and so more patients get allocated to this, while treatment 3 is sort of in between, and so we're going to recruit about the same numbers as before. And obviously you can do this multiple times. So it will increase the chance that the trial patients receive the best treatment. There's some challenges around, I need observations that are relatively quickly observed, and there's a lot of strong opinions about these types of adaptive designs. So just to wrap up, the fixed sample randomized controlled trials is the gold standard, no question. But adaptive methods can provide notable benefit. implementation is going to be more complex, and as a consequence of that, also additional statistical considerations are going to be necessary. Thank you.
Going to allow for one question, if there's any in the audience for Thomas. Yes.
I was interested in your enrichment design and how that differs from a phenotype stratification design. So in a phenotype stratification design, you would stratify by your biomarker phenotypes, whatever it is, go through to randomization and stop interventions if they're not working, or carry through the superior ones, or ones that have potential to be superior. With this one, how does this design differ to that in terms of the decisions that you make and the efficiencies in the sample size?
So I'm not exactly sure what your alternative design is, but from your description, I think they're going to be very, very similar. As long as, so here it's the same treatment that's being used. So it's not a specific treatment that I'm using for each. Well, I suspect that what you're describing has targeted treatments for particular groups, or maybe I misunderstood.
Yeah, I think so. It's in here you're stopping the females because it's not working and you're taking through the males.
Yeah.
You could start off by stratifying by male and female and taking them through as sort of a priori stratification and looking individually in each one, and then stopping the females anyway if it's not working.
Yeah. So yeah. Okay. So within the first part, you would usually stratify anyway, or randomization, because otherwise you just have too much of a risk that you get just males or just females anyway in the first place. So you would do stratification within the first stage here as well. So I suspect they are very similar.
Okay.
We can have one more question if anyone has one. There in the back, I think.
Thank you for that overview. I had a question about response adaptive randomization. I think that the intuitive aspect of that seems pretty straightforward, but one of the things that we've been struggling with in this design aspect is, don't we want to get to the futility question as much as we want to get to the efficacy question? In other words, does it make sense to decrease allocation to what appears to be an underperforming arm, which would slow the decision to remove it?
I mean, there are other people in the room that know more about these designs than me, but my take here would be, by decreasing the allocation ratios, if you keep going, you're effectively going to get an allocation ratio 0 anyway if you allow that, and that would effectively be your futility decision anyway. So you might not have this sort of classic futility bounds, but you could still give up once your allocation ratio is too small, because that's obviously evidence that things aren't going very well.
One more quick question here.
Just a comment on that question. The response adaptive randomization works a little bit differently. Response adaptive randomization works a little bit differently depending on whether it's a fixed trial with specific number of arms in, or a platform trial.
Sure.
The question seemed to be more in what the questioner was asking is something that does happen in a platform trial. So in a platform trial, you're going to keep going with your reduced randomized arm, and it may just hang in there for a long time if you don't have other rules to get rid of it. So he's quite right. In a platform trial setting, what you've done is delayed. You could potentially be just delaying a futility decision.
Okay, I think we'll leave more questions for after. We'll thank Thomas again.